Hey guys, welcome back to Andrew Invest. Today I want to talk to you about ARM. So ARM hit the headlines earlier this week after deciding to IPO in New York, basically completely ignoring its home market of London. And why is this a big deal? So ARM is one of the few British technology companies to still be standing, other than our friend up here. And this is obviously very politically contentious for the Conservative Party in the UK, as we see companies choosing to list in New York instead of Britain. So why has this happened, and should we be interested in ARM as an investment when it IPOs later this year? In other news, Facebook and Meta decided to lower the price of its VR, basically showing that demand for VR is a lot less than what the company was expecting and hoping for. What does this mean for our Meta investments, and what does it mean for the future of VR? Last but not least, here's a portfolio update. I haven't done one in a while, but that's not because I'm trying to hide anything. It's just because I've not got around to it. So here's the total value of my portfolio, and here's the performance of my individual holdings over the last week. I will always post updates whether I'm doing well or badly, so stick around to see more over the next year. So I want to quickly take you through this video by the Financial Times, which goes through some of the history behind ARM. It talks about how important ARM is for the global chip economy and some of the political contentiousness behind decisions to sell it to certain companies and the decision to IPO it. So this video is actually from 2022, so some of the information is a little bit outdated, but I'll talk about it as we go along. So some funky music to start us off.
ARM is arguably the UK's biggest tech success story. Owned by Japanese conglomerate SoftBank, it designs complex semiconductors and sells the IP to chip makers around the world. Between 2 and 10 ARM-based chips can be found in pretty much every single smartphone. Its IP is also in laptops and computers, TVs, household appliances, and cars. Over 200 billion ARM-based chips have shipped to date. No wonder then that the company has found itself at the centre of a battle over its future. Last year, SoftBank tried to sell ARM to Nvidia of the US, a move which faced huge criticism from rival chipmakers and tech industry insiders, who were adamant that it would compromise ARM's neutrality in a ferociously competitive market. Disrupted supply chains due to the pandemic, extreme weather events, and geopolitical tensions have laid bare the fragile networks underpinning the chip sector. As governments pour billions into shoring up a domestic supply of chips, and as tensions between China and the West calcify, who owns and has access to what has become more important than ever. In 2016, days after the UK voted to leave the EU, SoftBank swooped in to buy ARM, which, at the time, Theresa May's government promoted as a vote of confidence in post-Brexit Britain.
Anything but.
But many tech champions argue it was a huge mistake, though they say there is now an opportunity to course correct. SoftBank plans to float ARM on the stock exchange next year, and has already stated its preference to list in New York. But the UK has been fighting tooth and nail to get SoftBank to at least pursue a dual listing for the company in London, to bolster Britain's reputation and ensure domestic investors can buy a stake. Meanwhile, Qualcomm...
As we know, that obviously failed. There's going to be no secondary listing of ARM in the UK, despite it being originally a British company, which is a pretty huge failure for, a company that is pretty much Britain's biggest technology company. And it's a remarkable mistake by the Theresa May government for it to be sold in the first place. So British investors will have to buy this in dollar terms.
Has advocated for forming a consortium of chipmakers to invest in the company when it IPOs. ARM's IP is likely to become more ubiquitous and valuable than ever. But after a tech stock rout earlier this year, and with IPO markets all but drying up, it remains to be seen whether SoftBank will raise enough money to invest in this ambitious future.
So based on that video, we now know how important ARM is to the global chip economy, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good investment. what do we know about the company's actual financials and its balance sheet? So ARM is a private company and it's not actually required to post its balance sheet or profits or anything like that, even its revenue. However, ARM does post reports every quarter of some select figures like total revenues. And we can see for the financial year 2021, its revenues were at $2.7 billion with strong growth across the board. Extrapolating the growth in 2022, where they posted similar figures of around 25%, we could estimate that its financial year 2022 revenue was around $3.2 billion. Now, analysts were estimating that the company would IPO for around $37 billion market cap, which would give a price to sales value of around 11.5 or so. Let's compare that to rivals like Nvidia. So Nvidia has a price to sales of around 14, which is higher, and yet its market cap is nearly 10 times above that, 15 times above that $37 billion value, which gives Nvidia a lot less room for growth compared to ARM. As we know, the law of large numbers suggests that as companies get bigger, it's harder to grow your company, which is just obvious by common sense. So I think this is a really interesting investment. I think that as soon as they post the actual financial details when the IPO is closer, I'll definitely be making a video on that, and it'll be really interesting to take a deep dive into its numbers, into its profitability. We don't actually fully know whether the company is profitable. It does make a significant amount of earnings after interest. EBITDA basically is after deductions like tax, interest, stuff like that. And it does have a EBITDA margin of 30%, which is really good. We don't actually know if after earnings, after interest, deductions, etc., if that is negative, but it seems likely that they do make a profit. And when those numbers come out, I think it'll be really interesting to take a look at them, and we'll know a lot more certain whether this company is investable or not. So, what are some of the risks of investing in ARM? Now, ironically, RISC, Risc, is the name of the chip design protocol that ARM uses. What is the difference between Risc and Risc-V? So Risc-V is basically a competitor to the ARM model, which is open source. Now, ARM basically produces and designs chips for their customers, including Apple, Samsung, lots of different devices. Now, that's a model that's really similar to what Intel used to do and still does, where they design chips on the behalf of their customers. Now, controversially, a few years ago, Apple switched from using Intel-designed chips to designing their own chips and having them produced by TSMC. Now, that was a huge model which basically has completely eaten into Intel's margins and basically is why Intel is declining massively over the last couple of years, amongst other reasons, of course. But Risc-V effectively does the same thing as what TSMC was doing, in the sense that it's an open source model which allows companies to design these RISC chips by themselves. Now, you would argue that ARM's performance is a lot better, and so they definitely won't get beaten by this Risc-V model. However, if you look at some of these performance comparisons below, Sci-Fi, a company which is using this Risc-V model, has performance which is pretty much on par, if not way better, than some of the ARM models. So could ARM potentially go the same way as Intel? And does it potentially have any offerings of this Risc-V model where it can allow companies to design their own chips and use ARM to produce them, similar to TSMC? Does it have any plans to do so? And I found this video online, which basically is from one of my favorite Bloomberg analysts, actually, who questioned the CEO about Risc-V and asked him what the company's plans are around that and if he had any thoughts about it. So I think this clip is really interesting, and let's see what he has to say.
Renee, good morning. It's Deirdre. So ARM, of course, occupies a really unique space in the chip industry, but an up-and-comer that more folks are talking about is a company called Risc-V that helps also companies design their own chips. It's open source, though, unlike ARM, and that eliminates the need for licensing fees. Some argue that that makes it cheaper and faster. How are you thinking about that competition and making sure that they don't eventually eat your lunch, especially in some of the newer spaces that you want to diversify into?
The real strength of any computer architecture is the software investment. For example, in the cloud, we've been at it for now about 10 years or so. Finally, we have all the distribution models ready, all the software ready, and now ARM is in every major data center in the planet. That took a long time. There's a huge software investment that's required with any architecture. There's been over 1.5 billion developer hours. We did some estimates our team did in terms of the investment on ARM. And we're going to keep investing there. That is really where all the energy needs to go in any new computer architecture. So I think we're very well positioned there, and we'll continue to invest in the developer ecosystem.
So I think it was a really hard-hitting question, and that's what I really like about this particular Bloomberg analyst. And the CEO, I think, definitely struggled to answer it in a good way. He basically said that the company is investing a huge amount of money into its software architecture, which would imply that they're saying that their technology is far better than this Risc-V model, which, as we saw previously in the graphs, is not actually the case. They're pretty much on par with each other. So I really don't think that his answer that ARM is so important, it's so widely used in the industry currently, is that good of an explanation or, a future plan. Intel was also basically the market leader by far in the computer chip industry for PCs and laptops, and now it's getting its lunch eaten by AMD, Nvidia, lots of different companies, and it's declining massively. So I'm really not very reassured by the CEO's answer here. So I think between these risks and not knowing the financials yet, I would definitely not commit towards purchasing the IPO, but it's definitely something I'd be interested in. Finally, we have the news that Meta's cutting its prices for its high-end VR headsets. This is pretty surprising news, considering in 2022, Meta actually increased the price of their headsets. Now, if you look at my previous earnings video, we saw that the amount of revenue that the VR division of Meta made in 2022 actually decreased compared to 2021, despite them putting ever more money into R&D for that division. So I think this can be seen as a pretty abject failure. The Meta Quest 2 256 gigabyte version was meant to be $500, and it was that for about 8 months until the price now is being cut down to $430 again. So I think that there is a real lack of clear direction on the pricing strategy for VR. I think there's not enough demand, and I really think that VR is failing. It's not doing anywhere near as well as what Mark Zuckerberg believes. And he's definitely a full convert into the VR camp. So it's a bit of a worry. However, in positive news, I am not investing in Meta for its VR capabilities. If you completely removed all the money that Meta spent on VR, it would massively increase its free cash flow margins and the profitability of the company as a whole. So I'm, to be honest, kind of hoping that in a few years, this VR experiment will be set to one side. If it does well, then it's only a bonus. If it doesn't do well, it's only going to be a drag for a few years, in my opinion, until the company eventually shelves it. Similar to how Google has shelved many projects such as Stadia. So I think it'll be really interesting to see the direction of VR strategy for Meta over the next couple of years. If it doesn't improve, I do think that they will basically abandon the project. However, that's it for today and this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you guys next time.